For me, having more information and having all of the info there in front of me has always felt very calming. Like, I love the way that I can see that you can swap in honey with maple syrup. You know that you're just kind of swapping like flavor profile for flavor profile.
This is Taste. I'm your host, Eliza Barbanel. Nicola Lamb is a pastry chef and recipe developer based in London. After training in some of London and New York's top bakeries, like Dominic Ansel, Ottolenghi, and Happy Endings, she launched the pop-up bakery Lark and her popular newsletter Kitchen Projects. And now, a wonderful debut cookbook, Sift, that's truly the most comprehensive baking book I've read in years. It's so fun to have Nicola on the show to nerd out on pastry process and much more. Also on the show, Matt interviews Hetal Vasavada, author of the new cookbook Daisy Bakes. Nicola Lamb, this is Taste. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited.
Where in the world are you speaking to me from right now?
So right now I am in the former Minneapolis Grain Exchange, which feels very appropriate because it has it's a co-working space. So I'm in a little studio here, so you can hear me clearly, but it still has the board with all of the prices from grain in 2008 when they last traded here. So it feels right to be talking about baking here.
Wow, what an auspicious place for us to be talking, like really nerding out on baking together.
I know.
Also, I love hearing that you're here in the American Midwest and not over in London. What are you doing over here right now?
So my fiance grew up here in the great state of Minnesota. So we're here doing a few family things. Of course, I'm going to be going to the state fair this week because it opens on Thursday. Have you ever been?
I have not been to your state fair that you're in right now, but I've been to other state fairs, and I'm really excited for you to get to eat a bunch of deep fried things.
It's everything on a stick. I'm looking forward to it. We go every year, and every year they manage to pull something out the bag. I think this year that there's deep fried ranch dressing I saw on the website. So I'll let you know how that goes.
Oh my God. I'm picturing is it a shot of ranch? Is it how? I have so many questions.
So on the website, I think it looks like, okay, I don't know if this is I didn't grow up with Hot Pockets, but I think it's a Hot Pocket filled with ranch dressing. It sounds kind of dangerous. I'm not going to lie. I'm going to leave them for a few minutes before I bite into it, because otherwise I think there's going to be some kind of ranch scalding kind of accident that might happen.
Molten ranch. Have you had a deep fried Oreo before?
I haven't, but I'm pretty sure I'll add that. I can get one at the state fair.
Yeah.
I think maybe I'll add that to my list.
If you can handle just a lot of deep fried things, I really think as a baker you should try one because they're kind of phenomenal. The interior of the Oreo, I guess it's kind of fluff, I guess you would say. It gets that kind of liquidy, gooey quality. And I think growing up when I would go to the San Diego State Fair, my sister and I would just beeline for the deep fried Oreos. They're quite good.
That's so fun. Well, in the UK, we have deep fried Mars bars. And I don't know if Mars is the same in the UK as the US, but that's like the nougat caramel chocolate candy bar. And that's pretty classic at a fish and chip shop. And I think they fry it all in the same oil. So there's definitely some sweet, savory, fishy chocolate flavors going on, but you kind of just have to embrace it.
That's so funny. I think our version of a Mars bar is Milky Way, maybe, or Three Musketeers. But
oh yeah,
I love that that's available. And I really would love to talk to you about deep fried state fair food all day. But I have you here to talk about your new book, which is so exciting. And I want to talk about this book because I think it's one of the nerdiest baking books I've ever read before. Do you take that as a compliment?
Such a compliment. I love the idea of making reference books need to have a comeback. I think that sometimes there's this anxiety that it feels too much like school, but the reality is like once you kind of leave school, you realize how fun school actually is. So then in your adult life, you can really just create your own curriculum of things that you're interested in. So I kind of love the idea of producing a book that was really nerdy and it gave people a space to just lean into the thing that they are interested in this case, baking.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense because you have this great background of training and working in some of the best bakeries across London and New York, Dominic Ansel, Ottolenghi, Happy Endings, Little Bread Peddler. Do you feel like it's in those kitchens that you learned this kind of science and technique, or how did you kind of get the skill set to make what this really beautiful, intricate baking almost reference book?
So I will tell you, I'll be honest right now. I did start going to pastry school and I dropped out. I just
Oh.
decided, I know it's one of those parts of my history. I'm like, is this a good thing or a bad thing? So I moved to New York when I was in my early 20s. I think I was 22. And with the idea of going to pastry school, mainly because I wanted the visa and it's quite hard. I don't know if you know, but the US is pretty tricky to get a visa. And I really wanted to be in New York, live in New York. And so I thought, let's kill two birds with one stone, go and have loads of fun in New York and also learn how to be a pastry chef. But before I started school, I had about a month or two in the city and I decided to get a job in a bakery because I thought, well, I should probably find out if this is something that I like or not. So I managed to kind of get in touch with the team at Dominic Ansel. I started showing up and just chatting with them and really just like being a little bit pushy about trying to get into their kitchen, even though I had no experience because I just knew that I was, I was such a fan and I just thought it would be so much fun to learn from those chefs. And they eventually gave me a job, even though I did the world's worst trial. And that's probably a story for another time. But my goodness, they must have been really desperate at the time. But they let me into the kitchen, and it really just clicked for me there. I completely fell in love with the almost the I loved the mass production of working in a bakery almost. I thought it was so much fun that you would make like 10, 20, 30 kilos of cookie dough and you would learn how to just make them perfect and the same every single time. And so I would suppose that's where I really learned everything that I now know about baking. That's where it started. And to this day, some of the best lessons that I've ever learned more than in cookbooks have been when my pastry chef and my head chef have been standing next to me and they've been showing me how the dough should look or what I should be looking for, how I should use my nose and my ears and my eyes and use all of my senses when I'm in the kitchen.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. And it must be so fascinating to learn about how to make things at scale and then later on be adapting them for, your smaller pop up bakery or making
Mm-hmm,
pastries at home, but you do have this kind of like biology book level of diagrams in the book, like all of
mm-hmm.
the components of a wheat kernel. I loved your world of sugars chart, which has like 16, I think, different kinds of sweetener, and you have it by flavor profile and water content and pH and all of these factors that I would imagine make a lot of sense for somebody that's baking regularly. But for a novice like myself, I'm getting lost in the water content of all of these different types of things. Why did you want to do charts in this way in your book? And did you draw them yourself or how did they get created?
So I definitely didn't draw these charts myself because if you saw what this manuscript looked like when it was submitted, no one would buy this book. I mean, design was so important in SIFT. Um, for me, having more information and having all of the info there in front of me has always felt very calming. Like, I love the way that I can see that you could swap in honey with maple syrup and realize, there's not too much different going on with, let's say, the water content. And you know that you're just kind of swapping like flavor profile for flavor profile. I feel very secure knowing all of that information. So I just kind of wanted to put it all in one place, in displayed in a way that was enjoyable to spend time in. And yeah, I suppose for me, it's always been the more you know, the kind of safer and more confident I feel. And I hope that that's the same for home bakers.
Yeah, I do think it feels very reassuring to understand the science behind things and know that it actually is a reference book that you can turn back to again.
Mhm.
In your intro for SIFT, you talk about being a detective with strings connecting different elements of pastry. And you say, I'll quote, how choux buns are connected to bagels, how brioche relates to ganache, and what jam and ice cream have in common. I would not say any of those things are related. And I'm wondering if you could walk me through maybe one or two of those connections.
Well, look, I had to start the book with a little bit of drama. I had to set a bit of drama so
Girl, I
people
was
would want to
hooked.
read and they would, okay, good. I did my job. So, how nerdy are we going to get? I mean, are people going to switch off? Okay.
I think
Do you know about
let's
starch?
like geek out on one maybe?
Tell me, do you know about starch gelatinization?
Well, before I read this section of your book, no. So let's say that I
Okay.
don't.
I feel like my publishers are going to be like, so what did you talk about? Did you talk about how like fun and welcoming this book is? And I'll be like, no, we talked about starch gelatinization. So starch gelatinization is a process that any starch, whether that's cornstarch, whether that's the starch in flour, goes through when it is hydrated and it's heated. And that's when it turns from a thin liquid, let's say it's been dissolved in some water, to a nice thick liquid. And starch gelatinization is one of the main factors of texture in your cakes. It's what makes your cakes spongy and soft more than anything else. Like it's that starch gelatinization. And so when you take a bagel, and I think most people who are listening to this will know that before you bake a bagel in the oven, you boil it in water. And that is what's happening. You are gelatinizing the outside of the bagel. And that is why a bagel has that like chewy, kind of like soft crust that we know and love. And that is exactly the same thing that's happening in your cakes. It's the same thing when you make choux pastry. If you ever made choux pastry, you might know that you heat up milk and water and butter, and then you throw in your flour and you stir, 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 and it goes from a liquid to this beautiful clumpy dough. And so it's exactly the same things that are happening in both. And again, I really loved the way that I realized that there was a really kind of finite things that were happening and finite processes that were happening when you were baking. And again, this word reassuring, I loved that. I was like, hey, I understand what is happening when I cook a bagel. Wait, that's the same thing that happens to choux pastry. And I just suddenly felt like I had so much more power over everything I was making. And it made so many different bakes seem way less intimidating.
Yeah, that was such an excellent breakdown. And I think that even as someone who, I've watched people make choux on Great British Bake Off, I haven't made it
Mm-hmm.
myself, but I certainly like to eat eclairs as well. Like, I think seeing those connections is really empowering because then when you do want to mess around with what you're adding into the mix, right, with flavorings or things like that, you
Mm-hmm.
understand like what is essential to making something and what can be riffed around. Is that kind of your goal with trying to have
Totally.
this information?
Yeah, exactly. I want people to be able to go, hey, I know how to do that. Or like, wait, we're doing an emulsion. That's, for example, how brioche and ganache relate to each other. You're like, oh, I totally get that. Like sometimes emulsions can break. Sometimes when you're putting fat into something, into liquid, that can kind of break and you have to be a bit careful. I just really think that once people realize that it is all kind of the same things, but you're using different tools and you've got sort of like a different canvas each time, you realize that you've actually mastered so many more things than you would ever realize.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm so curious when you came time to sit down and make this book, you have a great newsletter, Kitchen Projects, where you share recipes. You've done your own pop-up bakery before. Like,
Mhm.
how did you approach like what kinds of recipes you wanted to include in your cookbook?
So it was really interesting writing all of the recipes for the cookbook because I really wanted there to be those great base recipes, but I wanted them to have, I guess, a little bit of a twist. I wanted people to see like how you can put flavors in again to kind of encourage people to do it for themselves. I love it when people make my recipes start to finish verbatim. That makes me really excited and honored. But I also find it very exciting when I see someone doing a twist on the recipe. And so that's why, for example, when I have a milk bread babka, that you can realize that you can use this like babka shape and use this traditional shape with a less traditional dough. And so it was a little bit of kind of connecting the dots between base recipes that you could use over and over again, whether that's like a sweet tart dough, whether that's puff pastry, whether that's a really great like genoise or airy sponge, and then recipes with more of a twist. I also wanted them to be buildable. I'm sure if you've looked through the cookbook, you'll see that each recipe not only has a timeline, because I never want to lie to people about how long things take to make. I think we've all been there where we've been making a recipe and then it says, chill for 4 hours. You're like, excuse me, I have guests coming over in 20 minutes. No one told me this. So every single recipe has a timeline, and every single recipe also has those techniques listed. So, for example, if you were to look at bagels and choux, those two examples that we've talked about, they would both have starch gelatinization. So when I was putting this cookbook together, I really wanted there to be a wide expanse of recipes that you could build on, and ones that really teach you those crucial factors of baking.
Yeah, I love the timeline for each recipe. I think I've never really felt panic in the same way as I felt when I was making a pumpkin cheesecake for Thanksgiving, and I realized that it needed to come up to temperature before I could work with it, and then I needed to cool back down, and you know how that goes.
I've been there. I've been there for sure.
I think I like texted every member of my family that was staying in my parents' house, and I said, whoever wakes up first, please put all of the cream cheese on the counter so it could come up to temperature. And then I said this to a pastry chef friend of mine, and she said that I should have just left it out overnight and that people actually do that in bakeries all the time. So maybe it was all for nothing.
Well, now you know. Now you know. This is the thing, and this is why I feel like, you have pastry chef friends in your life. I have friends that text me, and it's so these things that you don't realize you can do or are quote unquote allowed. I think that especially with baking, people are always waiting to get permission, because sometimes you don't realize that, yeah, sure, you can roast a strawberry, that's going to make it more flavorful, but you kind of have to wait for someone to give you that permission. So that's why in this book, I really wanted to give you all of the information, and that way readers can kind of make their own lives easier, and they can know that they've got the permission and science of baking behind them to kind of alleviate that stress.
Yeah, definitely. I'm certainly the rarity in that I have the pastry chef to text on call, but everyone can have the cookbook, I guess.
For sure.
Are there any recipes in the book that you would maybe nominate for somebody if they were just starting out and trying to decide which recipe from the book they wanted to make first?
So when I went to write this cookbook, I was trying to work out how to divide the recipes, and I have divided by how long they take to make. And so I have three sections. I have an afternoon, and so that's recipes that take up to kind of 3, 4 hours, and that's including chilling time. So I know that might seem like a long time, but that's like really letting everything chill. And most kind of under 2 or even 1 hour. And then the second section of the book is a day. So that's recipes that will take kind of over a day to make. So that's where you'll get your yeasted goods and things like that. And section 3 is a weekend. And that's real projects, things like croissants and millefeuille and things that really are going to take a bit more time. So for someone that's really just dipping their toe in, I would say open up the book and go to an afternoon. And there you have a whole range of recipes that are going to be really exciting and hopefully delicious. I think that a Victoria sponge, I don't know how big the Victoria sponge is in the US, but I think the Victoria sponge is such a great classic cake. And it's kind of based on a pound cake. So I know that most pound cake in the US is kind of baked in a loaf tin. Am I right in saying that?
I don't think we're using the same word for pancake. Like a flapjack?
Oh, pound cake.
Pound
Oh, a
cake.
pound
Oh,
cake.
yes, in a loaf
Yeah.
tin. Yes.
Yeah. And so the Victoria sponge in the UK is pretty much a pound cake, but we bake it in a round tin.
Mm.
And then we halve it and we put cream and jam inside. So I think that for someone that just loves cakes and kind of understands that a pound cake is equal parts eggs, butter, sugar, flour, the Victoria sponge is normally based on that. But in my recipe, what I've done is I've kind of broken down where the fat comes from. So rather than just butter, I've also got extra egg yolks in there, which bring fat. I think that cake is a really good lesson in how to kind of build your recipes and keep that balance of fat, eggs, sugar, and flour, but getting them from different sources.
Nicola, you really are a dessert detective, because I never thought about the fact that a pound cake and a Victoria sponge are related. But now that you say that, that actually does make a lot of sense. That's so interesting.
Exactly. And I also think the pound cake, what magic is it in this world that it just so happens that equal parts egg, flour, sugar, and butter make a perfect cake? Like, that's so cool to me. That to me was when I realized that baking was amazing when I was younger. I was like, what are the chances? Like, how many recipes do you mix equal parts of things and get something that great? Like, it's very rare. It made me
Yeah,
realize that cake's magic.
it is very fated. I want to talk to you about the title of your book also, because I think there's so much. I would imagine if I was writing a cookbook, I would spend years debating what I would want the title to be, and that there's all kinds of conversations that you have, not only with your friends and your peers, but with your editor and your publisher.
Mhm.
Why is SIFT the title that you landed on?
The original title of the book was How to Build a Bake, and that is now a chapter of the book. And when I pitched that book, and I realize now maybe it's not the most sellable name, and I realize that now, but at the time, it was really what I was trying to achieve. And this idea that Every single thing that you bake is just a sum of its parts, that you are literally an architect in the kitchen when you're baking. So that was the original title. So we really wanted to come up with something that sort of reflected that, but was a bit more snappy. So there is a Google Doc somewhere deep, deep, deep in my archive, which probably has about 200 baking related words, some terrible, terrible titles that will never ever see the light of day. But somewhere among all of those titles, Sift sort of came, and it was me and my editor in the UK and my agent as well. We all had this access to this Google Doc, and we were just throwing things in. I was like whisk, sift, dough ball, like
Crap,
anything, like
yeah.
scoop. Honestly, it was everything. And then we started thinking about sift, and we realized that it had that perfect double meaning. So obviously, it's a very clearly a baking word, which helps when it's a baking book. And the idea that I was sifting through all of this information to kind of sort of get the goods. So that's what I've done in this book. The way that it's broken down is I have done all of this reading and all of this research and all of this information that has been so kindly gifted to me through the years, standing next to brilliant chefs in kitchens. And I've sort of sifted through that, and I've tried to distill it, I suppose, down to what I think are those crucial elements. And of course, you can always go deeper into all of these topics, but what I really wanted to get were those really useful nuggets. And yeah, so that's, I think SIFT just made sense.
Yeah, I think it's a great title. It also is an action word. It has so much movement that's happening
Mm-hmm.
in it. And also, I feel
Yeah.
like sifting is something, I hate to admit this to you, but I feel like sometimes I skip that step in a recipe.
But that's so, and you know what? That is the ironic thing about the fact that the book is called Sift, because I am not really telling you to sift. There's only a few recipes in the book where I specify sifting. And so that's the kind of irony of it. So that's like a little wink to people that know me, because they'll know that if they come and bake with me, I'm not always sifting. Often I give it my flour a little whisk to kind of aerate it. But I normally only sift if I'm making a really fine cake, like a chiffon or a genoise, where I really want to make sure that there's going to be no lumps. Like whenever you're putting flour into something very wet, it's usually best to sift it. But if you're putting flour into something that's something like butter, which is maybe a bit more solid, then normally you can get away with
Okay, I feel better already.
it.
I wanted to chat with you a little bit about what it's like running Lark, which is your pop-up bakery. I feel like there's so much that's involved in doing a pop-up bakery when it comes to like thinking about what people might want to eat in a very specific context, or certainly like going to different spaces and baking there or like finishing everything there. What do you think you've learned from running a pop-up bakery as opposed to when you've been working in other kitchens?
I feel like with a pop up, you really have to learn to follow your gut and just keep on going. There are no do overs with a pop up. And I think sometimes you kind of go through like the 7 stages of grief, like just before you open, where you're just so stressed. You're in denial. Like, why did I decide to do this? Oh my goodness. How are we going to fit everything in the fridge? Like, what was I thinking? This was crazy. Have I made enough? Have I made too much? You go through it all. I mean, every single time when I'm prepping for a pop up, there's always one moment, normally kind of late at night, where I go, Nicola, why have you done this? Why have you done this? Every time, like you always feel stressed. Why have you done this? And then the next day, I completely forget about that feeling. It's sort of like giving birth. Like you forget about the pain until you're then later doing it again. And so I think that what I've learned, and when I've worked and collaborated with other chefs, and it's like, don't sweat the small stuff with the pop up. What you're doing is you're producing a really fun event. Also, it's normally cake or pie or something that makes people very happy. And I think that when you're making or when you're baking for other people, you have to do it with joy. Otherwise, I don't think it's going to taste as good. So with a pop up, you just have to really like learn to just like cut the fat. Don't stress, have those moments where you're talking to yourself in the walk in and trying to convince yourself that you're crazy and that, never to do this again. And then you move past it. And then you often are just so proud of what you've produced. So it's definitely taught me just to to proceed and to be flexible. And if the caramel sauce burns, okay, let's make another batch of caramel that's way too light, and then you mix them together, and then that's okay. Now we've saved the burnt caramel. So there's always like ways around it. It's definitely taught me to be flexible.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like something you do that I've at least seen on Instagram that seems fun is you have fun themes or like concepts around the pop-ups, which
Yeah.
I think gives it a nice excuse. I love this idea that you did back in June that was it was with a pottery collab, right? And then all
Yes.
of the plates
Oh,
were made special.
that was so fun. That is one of the best things about the pop-ups is coming up with the concept. So it was called Cake on a Plate. And my friend Nicola, who was actually another Nicola, she was my one of my first teachers at the bakery, and she's since left being a baker, and she now has a pottery company called Burnt Crust Pottery. Her stuff is brilliant. And she threw all of these perfect cake plates. And the idea was that you could come along, get some pastry, and you could get a cake on the plate. So you would take away your plate afterwards, which was just really cute. And I would definitely do that one again.
Yeah, I love that idea. And I love the look of this vanilla and bay leaf custard slice that you did for
Oh,
that. I feel like the US is not on our custard game enough. I
I
feel like
know.
London is really leading the way.
We are obsessed with custard. Okay, but I think America is confused because I think pudding is very, very similar to custard, and this is trouble that I get into because I don't know that I fully understand what pudding is. But you can you tell me pudding and custard? How similar are we talking?
See, now I'm gonna get in trouble because they do seem similar. I think to me, like, we really only have chocolate pudding. If we're using
Right.
like the American, like the cup of jiggly custard that you eat with a spoon, I feel like chocolate
Yeah.
pudding is kind of the
Okay.
only pudding that you're served. It's pretty rare to have like a vanilla pudding, but I do think that
Okay.
vanilla pudding is probably custard.
That's what I mean. I think it's similar because it's often, I mean, you have all types of custards. There's a whole world of custards. You can have the baked custards, creme brulee. I mean, there's definitely different types, but certainly that kind of jiggly, wobbly, thick custard, especially in a custard slice, I think that has quite a lot in common with pudding because it's a starch thickened custard. And it's also like the delicious custard that you get inside fruit danishes, which I know you guys love in the US. So we just need to, I'm going to do my bit for custard. When I tour
I
this
think
book
so.
in November, I'm going to do my bit for custard.
I'm rooting for you. And I think we're getting there because I do think like a Danish obviously has that custard in it. I think
Mhm.
that like there are some bakeries here in New York that are starting to do what I would consider to be more of a custard slice, but really the
Mhm.
custard slice that we're talking about is this, is it puff pastry? Like two
Yeah,
slabs of
it's
puff
puff
pastry
pastry.
with a lot of set custard in between. And I think it's that
Mhm.
ratio that I really crave that I don't see as often here. I'm curious if there are any other UK baking trends that you've been noticing recently that you've been enjoying, like maybe ones that you would wish would catch on over here on our side as well.
So, funnily enough, I actually think the UK is taking quite a lot from the US, and I don't know if it's going to be the other way around. Okay, so England recently discovered everything bagel seasoning. Like, I know that's so standard. That's so standard in the US, but people in the UK are like, what is this magical mix of seeds and garlic? It's so delicious. So there is so much um, everything seasoning on pastries in the UK. And so, we've definitely taken that. Custard is probably the biggest one I would say that needs to kind of come over to the US. I'm trying to think if there's any other really classic British. What about hot cross buns? How are you guys on
Yeah,
hot cross buns?
I don't really see them, but I like a pull
Okay,
apart bun, you know?
guys, you got to get on the hot cross buns. It's so exciting. Every time Easter comes around, there's this moment where you realize about a month before Easter that every single bakery is going to be serving up these gorgeous, warm, glazed, soft, puffy buns. And you get them home from the bakery. I like to toast them personally, even if they're fresh. Loads and loads of melted butter on them and a big hit of sea salt. So delicious. And it's just a very simple kind of spice dough with it's got candied fruit in it and raisins and currants. And I think that that is something that the US could get excited about every Easter. It's just one of those like fun food things. In the same way that you guys might get excited about pies around Thanksgiving. It's that same excitement. Like imagine if you had something to have that build up. Like it's fun.
I like it. I like making the case for that. I noticed that you've
Mhm.
been doing some things with fig leaf as a flavor, and I think that also is kind of like an up and coming baking flavor.
For sure. I think is that do people have a lot of fig trees in the US? Because around London, where I live, there's so many fig trees. You can forage very, very easily.
Oh, that's very sweet. I mean, they're in pockets. I grew up in California and there's a lot of figs there. And actually, in Brooklyn, there are fig trees around because there were
Mm.
a group of, I think, Italian immigrants that planted them a long time ago. But I wouldn't really
That's
say
smart.
they seem like you can't really forage them in the same kind of way. But I have seen a couple restaurants and bakeries here in New York that have been doing fig leaf as a flavor lately. And it does seem to be one of those kind of trendy new things that's coming up. And is it really just how are you getting the fig leaf flavor into whatever you're using?
I'm into all kinds of leaves, by the way. So fig leaf, yes. Bay leaf, yes. Peach leaves, amazing. Citrus tree leaves, like, come on, it's so delicious. In fact, I actually have a really great recipe, which I haven't published anyway yet, which is for a leafy lemon panna cotta. And you infuse, it's the same way that you would work with any leaf, where you can kind of toast them a little bit and just warm them up to help those oils release. So whether you're working with a fig leaf, a peach leaf, or whatever it is, you kind of warm them up. For a fig leaf, you can actually toast them quite dark, and then you get those more coconutty, brown, sugary flavors that come out. But you would just kind of warm them up a little bit, or if you're warming them up in the infusion, then that's going to heat up either way. Throw them into your milk or your water or whatever it is that you're infusing, cover it and just leave it. And then with infusions, I always just like keep tasting. Like that's my whole kind of thing. You just taste it until you feel like that flavor is there. If you're doing a hot infusion, you're probably looking at 1 to 2 hours. And if you're doing a cold infusion, you're going to want to leave it overnight. But yeah, that's how I would get that fig leaf flavor in. And so I've done that with panna cottas. And yeah, for the lemon leaf one, I just got all these beautiful citrus leaves. I put them into milk, I infused them, I made a really soft, bubbly panna cotta, and then I made a lemon jelly to go on top. And honestly, you eat it and it felt like being in a lemon tree. Like you're sitting in a lemon tree, looking out at a beautiful view, and just yeah, it's great. Leaves are all the rage. I think that's going to be the next big thing in the US.
Yeah, I think everywhere leaves. And with things like this leafy panna cotta, for example,
Mm.
like where are you finding your baking inspiration?
So I sometimes like to look backwards to get that inspiration. So I have a lot of cookbooks that I think are real classics, whether it's the Chez Panisse Desserts book. I really love the Zuni cookbook. It's got so many great classics. And the same, there's this wonderful food writer in the UK called Jane Grigson, who's so acerbic and funny. And she wrote brilliantly about fruit and all written in the 80s. And so the fact that she was able to write, she would have to work so hard to go and find the peach that she was writing about, or the aubergine, or the eggplant that she's writing about. And so I love her recipes because you know that she wasn't messing around. Like she was getting a peach. She might get 6 peaches, and that might be the only ones that she could get for months and months and months. So I really love looking back at some of those like core techniques and seeing the way that they were making the most out of what at the time was probably quite like a scarce supply of fruit and veg. So I do like to look kind of backwards at that. And then, of course, just every time I go to a new city, I think London, we've got so many great bakeries. So I obviously like to walk around my own neighborhood and check those out. But every time I go to a new city, I'm always impressed and at seeing, what people are making in that place. Like here in Minneapolis, I was just walking around and I was able to kind of see stuff like crumb cakes and coffee cake, which might seem so standard to you. But for me, I'm like, huh, London does not have crumb cakes or coffee cakes and things like that. So it's always fun to sort of check out what's happening there. And what might seem so normal to you is so rare and exotic to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I also think of you as a baker that's kind of connected to other people in that space online. Like, certainly through your newsletter, you have guest columnists that are contributing as well. What makes you want to be doing that with your newsletter and bringing in other people? And how do you kind of decide what recipes or holes you're looking to fill?
So I'm the first person to say that I do not know everything, and I'm thank goodness, because that would be so boring if I was just thought I was a real know-all about baking. I love that there are people who are really deep into their own specific topics. One of my columnists is the brilliant Camilla Wynn. She is a preserving master, like legit. Like I think that's her title. She is a preserving master,
It is her
and
title
she's
from like the Canadian government.
so cool. And that's so brilliant. And so I think, why would I be writing about marmalade and jam when I could commission work from Camilla? And what's great is that I really know her flavor profile now. She actually quite likes like Victorian type flavors. Like she loves like fruitcake and kind of boozy desserts. And that's not something that I particularly excel in. So it's so great to kind of back and forth kind of ideas and being like, hey, Camilla, you like rum baba, right? And she's like, yes. I'm like, great, because I think you'll do a better job than me. So I'm always looking for voices and for people who really know their subject well. I think it's just going to be coming from such a more authentic place than me muddling through a description of how to steam a Christmas pudding, for example.
Yeah, and Camilla's series is so fun. She's been doing, I think she's calling it poisonous pastries with you, right?
Yeah, it's a mixture. So we were like, should it be called dangerous goods or poisonous pastries? I was like, well, you call it poisonous pastries, but we don't want to get in trouble because we don't want people to, some people take things quite literally. And I did not want someone to think that we were actually publishing recipe. I don't want to get investigated if we're
Right.
publishing recipes that are going to be injurious to eat. So,
Right. They're
but the
not like
idea is that
actually deadly.
no, exactly. And I think what she says in the newsletters always is her line is that it's the dose that makes the poison. So for these things like licorice and for Noya, which is the kind of fruit pits, and I think we've got tonka bean coming up and we've got like a bunch in the bag. So yeah, that's been really fun with her. And it kind of also just really suits her like quite mischievous voice, which is I always love reading. So yeah, I wish I could say that I was more organized with topics. Sometimes I just wake up and have an idea for a cake or for a recipe, and so sometimes that's how it goes. There are, a list of recipes that I want to do. Like with the newsletter, I do try and hit those kind of big target recipes where I'm really testing the ins and outs of a very kind of specific or classic dish. For example, I have madeleines in my mind as something that I want to, do a big investigation about. So I do have a list of topics in my mind. I really should write them down at some point, but I do kind of have a rotating stock of classics to kind of get to, and then I kind of leave room to experiment around those.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think newsletters are interesting because you have access to data in a way that you don't always through other platforms.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can see
Mm-hmm.
which ones are being clicked on the most or which ones have the most
Mm-hmm.
engagement in the comments. And also through Instagram, you get tagged if someone is making something and wants to share that with you. Have you found
Yeah.
that there's like a certain kind of recipe that you know is always going to hit the hardest or be the most interest to your readers?
You know what? People really love cookies.
Yeah.
That's what I've learned over the many years, many, many years of doing recipes. A cookie recipe is always going to hit. People just love them. And I get it. I love cookies too. So I think chocolate also is also often really popular, kind of those comfort bakes, nostalgic bakes. I think people really have a lot of room in their heart for these baked goods that take them back to a time when they were little and either walking past the bakery window and going, "Oh, I must like go in and get that," or it being your birthday and you getting that chocolate cake that you've been looking at the bakery for months. So anything that really hits home on nostalgia, maybe with an updated twist, is often I think successful. And I think that makes sense because baking is homey. Like sure you can go to a fancy pastry shop if you can get like a beautiful petit gâteau and it's nothing like those desserts that you probably loved when you were little. But for the most part, baking is something we do for other people. It's often an act of love. It's an act of self-love. It's something that parents do with their kids, or maybe people have memories of their grandparents doing it with them. I certainly have those memories. And so any recipe that kind of hits those and like tugs those nostalgic heartstrings, I think is often a win.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And It's fun to know that everybody ultimately just wants to be a kid again in some kind of way.
Big time.
I'm curious if there are any tips or techniques in your book that you would recommend to a home baker that might be kind of like much actually more useful or kind of I feel like hacks sometimes have a negative connotation, but then
Mm.
once you cook with somebody who is a professional, they actually know all kinds of things that are so much easier. Is there anything that maybe when
Yeah.
you learned yourself was kind of a revelation?
So I guess one of the biggest things is people often say, like, if they're making like a chocolate ganache, whether it's in a frosting or it's to pour over something, people are very nervous about it splitting. And there are all these crazy hacks online. The way to fix a split ganache, and often the way to, fix anything, any emulsion that's split, is actually just adding a little bit of warm water, like a teaspoon at a time. Like, don't add more cream, don't add more chocolate. Like, the issue is there is not enough space for those fat droplets to get dispersed. So you just need to kind of expand your cream a little bit. So if you add a little bit of hot water and whisk it, it's going to come together so quickly. Like, don't mess around with heating and whisking it. Just start with a little bit of warm water. Don't add more fat, don't add more cream, and often it's going to just like come together super easily.
Oh, I love that. I've also heard that making a ganache in a food processor is like the best way to do that. Does that anything have to do with
Mm.
like extending? Are you like physically extending the cream and giving it more space by whipping it around that kind of way?
So I think food processors are popular because you aren't incorporating a lot of air when you are emulsifying. So I think some people think that if you were to whip to stir your ganache with a whisk, you're incorporating a lot of air, and that's going to create kind of a not too smooth ganache. I think that food processors are great, and I think immersion blenders, like hand blenders, you're going to
Mm.
get the same effect, that same smoothness. I will only take my food processor out if I really always have to think, what's going to take longer, making this by hand
Hmm.
or washing this up? Because it has to be it has to be a real time saver for me to get my food processor out. But I think that is probably wise because you're not incorporating too much air.
Well, I feel you on the food processor, so thanks for weighing in on that. And to close today, I want to play a little rapid fire game with you. So I'll give you a question and you can just kind of tell me the first answer that pops into your head.
Gotcha.
Okay, your favorite baking book.
Right now, it's got to be more than cake by Natasha Pickwick. It's so great. I'm loving it.
Great book. Your favorite season for baking.
Autumn or fall, whenever the apples are,
Yeah.
is the best time for baking.
The most challenging recipe to perfect in your new book when you're developing.
It was definitely croissants. I really wanted people to make croissants at home that resembled ones that they might be able to get at a bakery, and it takes a long time to come up with a recipe that's kind of fail safe for the home baker. So yeah, I'm really proud of that one too.
Well, congrats on that recipe then.
Thanks.
Your go-to item to order in the pastry case at a bakery.
I love anything like creamy and choux based. So like if I'm in a fancy bakery, I'm gonna go like a Paris Brest. Like that's gonna be my favorite.
Mm.
If I'm in kind of like a get down bakery, honestly, giant chocolate chip cookie, I think.
Your favorite ice cream flavor.
Mint chocolate chip for sure.
Something that you will never make from scratch. Is there anything that you would never make from scratch?
The one thing that people often ask me to make and do a recipe for is baguettes. And I will not do it. Making a great baguette in a home oven is so difficult. And I love nothing more than like that crispy, crackly, like baguettes bring me so much joy that I don't know if I'd be able to handle like all the sadness that the bad baguettes that I would make would bring. So baguettes is like really like far down on my list.
Well, I love that you're drawing the line somewhere. I think that's very healthy. Your favorite bakery in London?
It's called E5 Bakehouse. Have you ever been?
No, I haven't. I was just in London and I went to Jolene and had some really great pastries there.
Oh,
And
Jolene's
also
great. It's the
Forno, I really
family.
liked, and Bake Street.
Oh, I still haven't made it to Forno. I love Baker Street. Chloe is the pastry chef there. She's brilliant. Love her stuff. Yeah, that's a good tip.
But you're saying E5, is that what it's called?
E5. So it's just on London Fields, and I think they really kind of led the way with grain milling.
Mm.
They do this bread called the Stockholm bread, which is kind of a free form. really darkly baked kind of rye, and but it's like very light, so it's like very like strong white flour and rye, and it's so delicious. And they used amazing whole grains in all of their cookies and all of their stuff and all of their pain chocolats, and it's just really tasty. Like I love what they're doing.
Okay, I'll have to check it out on my next visit.
Yeah.
Okay, a bakery outside of London that's one of your favorites.
Have you heard about Lannon Bakery in Edinburgh?
I think I have, but give us the little shtick. What's the rundown?
Okay, Lannon is, I can't believe it's only been open for a year because it feels like it's already just like done so much and it's already created waves of inspiration. It's run by this brilliant woman called Darcy, and it's in Edinburgh, in a really cute part of Edinburgh called Stockbridge. And they specialize in viennoiserie, and not just like any kind of like any your standard. They do your standard croissant and your standard pain au chocolat, but they also do like the most beautiful danishes. When I was there, they were making this asparagus danish, and they were, you know how you go to a fancy restaurant and your asparagus comes out and it's been turned and it's like been beautifully prepared and it's got a little notch on the end. Like they do that to their asparagus that they're putting on a Danish. Like everything is so meticulous, and but it's also not. But it's not pretentious. Like it feels very homey when you're in there. But so much effort and love is going into every single pastry, and I really think they're like setting a bit of a gold standard for bakeries. So yeah, definitely Lannon. Oh, I'll be there every day.
A glowing review. I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, my final question is a fictional food scene, like from a book or a movie, that you wish you could eat in real life.
Ooh. Can I have two candidates?
Yes.
They're kind of different.
Yes.
Okay. Number one, I always think of the prison cooking scene in Goodfellas. You know, have you seen it when he's like slicing the garlic really thin and the voiceover is like, and yeah, and then he melts the thinly sliced garlic into the butter sauce. I'm like, oh, I want that so bad. And then it's like the meats that they're making a ragu with 3 different types of meat. I'm like, okay, I need that. And then my second candidate is definitely just like anything from Ratatouille. I know Ratatouille and Goodfellas, like very different movies, different vibes. But yeah, any of the food from Ratatouille, I just think I watched that movie and I'm like, man, I really want to try this rat's cuisine. I just think like, come on, let's have the dining experience.
Yeah, and what a dinner party that could be if you could combine both of those movies and get everyone together.
For sure, that would be great.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. It was so fun to speak with you, and congrats on your book.
Thank you. It was so great to talk to you, and let me know when you're next in London and we'll go and eat
all the
lots
pastries.
Of delicious pastries, yeah. Please.
Hetal Vasavada, welcome to This Is Taste. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited about Desi Bakes, 85 recipes bringing the best of Indian flavors to Western-style desserts. Your book is great. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. This was a labor of love.
I mean, I see it everywhere in the book, and I got to give it a nice read yesterday on PDF. I haven't actually held it yet, and I will soon. And yes, you absolutely, it's comprehensive, doing 85 baking recipes. What was it like thinking about your second book and getting these 85 recipes down? What's the general thesis of the book?
I would say the general thesis of the book is definitely highlighting Indian art, textiles, and handicrafts in the best way possible, which is in dessert form, in my opinion. And just showcasing how much, at least aesthetically, Indian culture and the things around me have inspired me. And for desserts, I feel like it's one of those things where you kind of eat with your eyes first. I mean, with any food, but especially desserts, like you can be so artful with it. And this is my way of kind of combining the art that I grew up with and seeing all around me with my passion for baking.
I read in the acknowledgments early on, you gave a lot of credit to textile designers, and now it makes sense. You're really inspired by textiles, and I think that's such a unique way to think about dessert because handicraft and craftsmanship is all what pastry is all about.
Yeah, it's all made with your hands. It's the fiddly work that goes into making things from scratch. And there's so much that's in common between, baking and crafting, in my opinion, that it really they both lend themselves to each other.
Well, before we get more into the book, and I have some specific questions about many of the cool recipes, let's zoom out a bit. I want to hear about San Francisco and some of the restaurants and bakeries that you love going to in your hometown.
Ooh, okay. I am like one of those people that will go back to the same spot over and over again if I feel like real deep comfort in it. And Bayshram has become one of my comfort spots. It's a Gujarati Indian restaurant in the Dog Patch that I was just there last night. Obsessed with. Chef Hina is like the auntie that everyone wants. And the food is just so comforting because she does highlight Gujarati cuisine, which is the state I'm from. If I'm ever feeling like homesick, that's where I'll go. And she really just cooks her love into her food.
Great recommendation. I have some questions about Gujarati cuisine, and it's really cool that you recommend a Gujarati restaurant because now I'm kind of obsessed and I want to go to all of them around the country because I love Gujarati cuisine. What was food like growing up in Jersey?
Ooh, okay. So Jersey has a very high population of Gujarati people. It's probably one of the most, I think it's the most Gujaratis outside of India, and one location is like in New Jersey. And growing up, we had what we call the Gujarati plate, which is dal, which is lentil soup, bhat, rice, shak, which is any, I guess for lack of better terms, curry, but it's usually a vegetable-based dish. And there's, curries that are dry. There are shaks that have a little bit more liquid to it. Or that are more soupy, I guess, or stewy. But shak is one of them. And then you have rotli, which is the flatbread that we eat. And we would have that fresh every single day. And it's not easy to make. It's definitely very labor intensive. But yeah, we grew up eating Gujarati food every single day. I would bring it to school. It was, if we went and traveled, we're very well known for traveling with thepla, which is a spicy flatbread everywhere we go, which is extremely true within my family, at least. But it was it's much lighter than the food that most people typically associate with Indian food, which is, the butter chickens and the creamy curries and whatnot. I don't think we ever put cream in anything that we ate other than the desserts.
And Gujarati cuisine is vegetarian mostly, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on where. Well, one, the religion, right? So there's Gujarati Muslims and the Parsis, and you have the Hindus, and their cuisines are different. But for the most space, and then you have Jains too. So depending, I know, depending on the religion and the area you're from within Gujarat, most people are vegetarian. I think Gujarati is the highest percentage of vegetarians in that state.
Yeah, and thanks for clarifying because I was pretty ignorant on how the state. I know Parsi, of course, is not vegetarian. I was in Mumbai recently, and I got to go to Sri Thakur Manjnali, which was, to be honest, Hetal was one of the best meals of my life. And I've talked about on the show. I thought that it opened up my eyes for what Gujarati cuisine can be, and it was like 40 or 50 courses and incredible. And I'm just absolutely blown away by Gujarati cuisine. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I would say even within Gujarat, the funny thing is it's very much kind of anywhere you look in Europe, like Italy, you have your northern Italian cuisine, southern Italian cuisine. Same thing goes with India, but even within the state of Gujarat, yes, you have differences between the religions when it comes to obviously diets and dietary restrictions, but also the dishes. But because of the location where Gujarat is, which is right on the border of Pakistan, but also right in the pit of the bay. So there was a lot of movement and immigration and, uh, you know, history to that area. So a lot of dishes have a lot of global um, origins. And Gujarati food has also been taken to so many places. If you look at like Ethiopia, a lot of their lentil dishes are very similar to Gujarati dishes. Um, Even because there was trade between Surat, which is one of the main port cities in India, and Ethiopia, they would bring tobacco from India to Ethiopia. They even called tobacco in Ethiopia Surat because of it.
Hmm.
There's also, the Persian movement that came in, the Greeks that came over with Alexander the Great so many years ago. There's surprisingly a lot of similarities between Italian, Greek, Ethiopian, and obviously African, because a lot of Gujaratis were brought there by the British to build railroads and be indentured servants. Um, Between Gujarati cuisine and I would say a lot of the globe, there's a lot of similarities, and I don't think many people realize that. Um,
No,
yeah.
no, absolutely not. And you see in New Jersey and in San Francisco, you see Gujarati cuisine. You see it in Long Island, and really, I'm wondering, looking at your expertise in the pastry realm and baking, how does Gujarati baking play out? Is there like a core a group of recipes that you'd say are part of the sweet side of Gujarati cuisine?
Within the Parsi community, there are baked goods. Within my community that I grew up in, there was not. There was no baking. Most homes don't even have ovens. If anything, you're like either roasting something on the stove or you're steaming it. And even then, cakes are not a thing, like sweet cakes, not a thing. So a lot of the desserts are deep fried
Yeah.
or it's roasted. So, like, roasting chickpea flour with ghee and then roasting that and then adding that to a really viscous, simple syrup to help it set. Or, roasting nut powders and then adding that to a simple syrup to let it set. Um, it's a lot more stove based versus oven based. Um, and I don't know if it's really considered baking if it's not oven based. I guess that's like more of a technical question.
Yeah, yeah. I'm using a very general term, but
Yeah.
you've really outlined the way that the sweeter side kind of develops in Gujarat, and
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting. You started your career not in food, but you have a master's degree in biological sciences, and you ended up moving out to San Francisco. Tell me a little bit about that background and what moved you west.
So, being Indian, my parents kind of were like, you're going to be either a doctor, engineer, or business person. Uh, it's, I get it. They want financial stability for me, something they didn't have growing up. And I understood. And I was like, I guess I'll go in healthcare. And I followed that path, did my, undergrad in biochem, did my master's. I worked at Columbia University Medical Center for some time. And then I got a job offer at a consulting firm out here in San Francisco. And I quickly realized that the corporate world was not meant for me.
Right.
I would get in trouble at work for like looking up at blogs, trying to figure out what I was going to make for dinner or what cake I was going to bake if our team met our goals. It was just not the world for me. It was not creative enough.
Well, obviously, you made the wise decision to leave the consulting world and leave your science degree behind. Though, of course, science is what baking is all
Yes.
about, and I'm sure there's some overlaps. But let's talk a little bit about these early days and how you started, baking at home as a novice, as a as like a fan of baking, and then you launched Milk and Cardamom, your website and your social media account. Talk about how you kind of went pro. I mean, not kind of, you went pro and you appeared on television, and you really have a beautiful work on your website. You have so many recipes. I'm a huge fan of yours. So
Thank you.
talk about that.
Yeah. So I one, obviously have an untraditional background for someone in the food industry, but when I was in college, my organic chemistry professor had told me if you could bake, you would pass lab. And
That's great.
I
I
was
love
like,
that.
Bet, I'm in. Let me learn how to bake. And again, growing up, I did not bake. This was not something that I learned. There was no like great grandmother's chocolate chip cookie recipe, nothing. So for me, this was like a whole new world. And like every other person out there, I started with box cake mix. And slowly, as I understood the chemistry of it and understanding like the method and the technicality of baking, I would start challenging myself to make things from scratch. And I would literally feed my entire dorm room. Um, and as I would start baking to learn how to pass Orgo Lab, I started falling in love with the, I guess, the A type part of me really enjoyed the accuracy and precision in baking and the fact that I can also eat it and share it with my friends. And it brought me a zen. I have like undiagnosed ADHD at that point and a lot of anxiety, and baking just really did a lot for my mental health and sanity. Um, and I never thought it was something I could pursue. But what I did do is I started a blog. It was called Pretty Polymath, which is so old. It was on Tumblr. Um,
Dope. I love
it was
that.
so old.
So good.
And it was literally just me writing recipes that I was coming up with to have somewhere to save it. But also during college is when I was actually able to also try new cuisines outside of Indian food. Growing up, we didn't really go out to eat that much or ever. But in college, me and my friends would like pool our money together and go like split a meal somewhere nice and fancy. And I got to try Ethiopian food and Malaysian food and just so many cuisines that it just opened up my world. So I would keep it all, use that blog to also track everything that I was eating and like my reviews and thoughts and what I thought about the food. And then over time, I kept that up until the corporate job here in San Francisco. I started seeing bloggers actually turning it into a full-time career. My first experience was seeing Pioneer Woman.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I remember
one of the originals. Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
She's an OG. I remember like going to her blog because she was one of the first people to actually put step-by-step photos in her blog, which is what blew her up. And then seeing her go full-time, I was like, oh, wow, like this might be something that I can do. But I still felt kind of a imposter because again, I didn't go to culinary school. Everything that I ever saw on TV about the culinary world, they're like, oh yeah, I went to CIA or I went to Cordon Bleu or whatever it may be. And I was nowhere near that caliber. I worked at the back of a pizzeria, for many years, but I didn't know if that really counted for anything.
I mean, it certainly did. I mean, working at a pizzeria will teach you, I would say, probably most of the skills you need to be a professional food person. I mean,
I couldn't.
I'm sure you were doing lots back there.
Yeah, I couldn't even agree more. Like, I was working 6 p.m. to like 2 a.m. shifts at that place, like 4 or 5 times a week. My parents had lost their jobs when I was in college, a freshman in college. I'm the first person in my family to ever go beyond high school. My dad has a 3rd grade education. My mom has a 10th grade education. So to pay for school, I worked at this pizzeria late at night. And that was like my only monetizable skill I had was to cook. But once I got into the corporate world, hated it, saw people actually making it big as bloggers, people like Pioneer Women. And I remember Pinch of Yum putting out, they used to do like a financial report and would post how they were making money. And I remember seeing it and I'm like, I could do that, but I didn't have like the full confidence yet. So for some reason, my husband thought it would be a good idea for me to go on reality TV. And I ended up on MasterChef. And
you kind of ruled MasterChef. I mean, you kind of like owned MasterChef. You didn't win, but you got pretty close. And for somebody who wasn't a quote unquote professional, it's very impressive that you went that far.
Thank you. Yeah, I honestly, especially being vegetarian and never have cooked meat in my life like that, I did not think that I was going to make it as far as I did. But it was definitely an experience that gave me a lot of confidence. A little trauma, but a good amount of confidence.
Right.
And when I came off, I decided to pursue recipe development. I had learned that there's just so many careers outside of chef in the food world. And I realized like recipe development was kind of the direction I wanted to go. It felt like being back in the lab. It felt like I enjoyed the testing and the failing and the figuring out what went wrong and fixing it aspect of recipe development. And that's when the blog started, is right when I came off MasterChef. I was like, I'm going to post my recipes on here. I'm going to share them. Fun fact about MasterChef, they own all the recipes that you make on the show. And after each episode, they make you write down the recipe for whatever you made, so that they can have it and own it. But second fun fact, you can't copyright a recipe.
Indeed.
So,
We talk about it a bit on the show.
yeah. So I would just, add a little extra salt or an extra spice and would share a recipe on my blog of like the cinnamon rolls I made during one of the challenges, or like anything that was that week's dish, I would share my recipe for it. And there was not much they could do about it. So
I love that's very savvy of you, and I think you've taken this career very seriously, almost like a scientific way, and researching the monetization of the website and the blog, and then of course being savvy with the way you were leveraging each recipe each week.
mm-hmm.
And I love to hear that, and I love that you called out that site that offer transparency for the economics.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's really cool, and that's really. I feel more folks should do that and share how you actually make money doing this.
Oh, 100%. The other thing about, I would say the blogging / even the cookbook writing world is there's not a lot of transparency behind how much people make. People don't share how much they made, or what does it, even for like social media content creation, like what a brand deal should look like, what's negotiable, how much should a brand be offering you? How do you price yourself? There's very little discussion that occurs. And a lot of people are just on their own. And this is where a lot of the pay disparities also occur. Like I found out one brand was paying my white counterparts almost like, I think it was $4,000 for the same job that I was doing. And I was getting paid $400.
Yeah.
Like those are the...
You fix that quickly, I'm sure.
Yes, very much so. But like talking about it really helps. Like understanding, like I really liked going to Pinch of Yams and seeing what's working for them, what's not working for them, how are they monetizing? Because, this is the real world. We do need to make an income to survive and pay for everything. And I very much appreciate it and took a lot of advice and, dissected what they did so that I could try and replicate it in my world.
So zooming out a bit, I have to say you have such a skill with bringing South Asian flavors and spices and techniques into a world that is, I would say, is firmly planted in American pastry. Brownies, cakes, Rice Krispie treats, Muddy Buddies, which we'll get into. Shouts to that. And let me ask you, this is not easy. And reading your book, Desi Bakes, it's clear that you have extreme talent in kind of translating flavors that feel extremely at home for you, but in the format of the American pastry world. How difficult is this work?
I think the most difficult part is trying to not combine the flavors, but combine the pastry techniques. Like I said earlier, so many of the Indian dessert techniques are roasting things in fat or, combining it with simple syrups and things like that. And I try to even combine pastry techniques. Like I have a besan burfi Rice Krispie treat recipe in the book, where besan burfi is basically chickpea flour toasted in ghee until it's super nutty. It's almost reminiscent of like peanut butter. And then I add that into a Rice Krispie mix. But, trying to understand, okay, how am I going to do this? I know this temperature of the ghee is going to be really hot. I don't want to overheat the marshmallows, because if you overheat marshmallows, you get really hard, inedible Rice Krispie treats. So trying to,
We've all been there.
yes, it's the worst feeling. So trying to understand how I'm going to mash these two together. Do I need to wait? Will this work? Do I need to change the temperature of things, etc.? And that is probably the hardest part, is how do I marry the two techniques or really make sure that the flavors pop out? But I grew up on like sneaking American desserts, save up all my money, go to the Italian bakery, go to the corner deli and, eat whatever I could that my mom wouldn't let me or make for me. And the inspiration for a lot of that is kind of similar to Christina Tosi. Like, she makes a lot of desserts from her childhood and wants to bring out the nostalgia from her childhood in many of the sweets, like the birthday cake, right? And that funfetti flavor. For me, I was trying to take out flavors from my childhood, which were a lot of Indian desserts, and mash that into the American flavors that I also grew up with, and try to figure out a way that I could kind of combine the both in a way that reminded me of my particular experiences. And what I learned after my first book came out is there is a whole generation of first generation Indian Americans who also grew up at Patel Brothers eating Gulfi, but also, were eating Ben and Jerry's, cookie dough ice cream, and learning how to mash the two together. It's just like, is literally me in a dessert. And it's a lot, what I think a lot of people feel.
Well, I think one of the desserts that really, embodies this ethic is one that really speaks to me as a Midwesterner. It's a pistachio and cardamom muddy buddy, or puppy chow, depending where you live. And I love it so much, and I'm going to make it this fall. Tell me what inspired this, and walk us through that recipe a bit.
I love Muddy Buddies.
Makes two of us.
Oh my God. The texture just does it for me. I like the cool powdered sugar the moment it hits your tongue and dissolves away. And then like the crispiness of like when you bite into the Muddy Buddy, and then you get that creaminess of the chocolate, and just there's like this whole textural symphony that occurs. And I love it. And something about Indian snacks is there's a lot of texture. If you ever pick up like the hot mix, as what they'll typically call it, it's a lot of texture. And you grab a fistful and shove it in your mouth, and you got peanuts, and you got flat cornflakes, and you have maybe crispy save, which is like little deep fried chickpea batter. And maybe you have raisins in there too. And like, it's always a textural symphony. I love it. And Muddy Buddies really reminded me of that. And I wanted to add in a little bit of an Indian flavor with using pistachios. They have a deep enough flavor that it can match with chocolate. And you know what? Now looking at it and seeing like the viral, have you seen the viral Dubai chocolate bars?
Yes, I have.
Okay.
Those are really, yes.
Yeah. Similar vibe, right? You have the crispy plus the chocolate plus the pistachio. And I add a little cardamom to it, obviously, because that's like my favorite.
Yeah.
But
well, it's so definitive for South Asia. You know, cardamom it's
our vanilla.
Yeah, that's good. I never thought of it that way. It's really smart.
Yeah,
it is your vanilla. Absolutely.
And it just makes it so good. I wanted something snacky that I could serve at a party, like a Diwali party or a Holi or Raksha Bandhan, which is actually today, which is a holiday celebrating, relationships between brothers and sisters. But I wanted something that like I could serve at a party that, the kids are going to love and the adults are going to love. And that's where the Muddy Buddies kind of came from.
So jamun seems like a really, really cool ingredient for baking, and it's new to me. I read about it, and you do it in a berry bar, and your cookbook is filled with recipes that use products that you can get frozen or freshened sometimes, but the brightness, the acidity balance for some of these products, I'm really, really excited to try these products. So to describe what's going on in this berry bar.
So this is a kind of like a shortbread berry bar. So you have a shortbread crust and then a bunch of berries that you put on top that you kind of cook down. And I use jamun in it. So jamun is a fruit that's in India, and it's known for its tartness. They'll have it in India in like shakes, or they'll even do jamun shots, which is just jamun juice that you like shoot because it's I got a really nice tart flavor. It kind of reminds me of like the purpose that rhubarb typically has in a lot of desserts, bringing in kind of a berry slash sourness to help level out a dessert. And that's how I played with it in this dessert bar. So instead of using traditional rhubarb and like strawberry, I decided to mix the berries with the jamun so that it balances out sweetness and sourness for really with a buttery cookie base. And it's a great way to use a fruit that people, at least like Indians, are obsessed with. Yes, we love mangoes, but I would say jamun is like a next like second favorite fruit that we have. And it is difficult to find it fresh here in the US unless you live in like Florida or somewhere more tropical. But my mom would get it frozen and she would make shakes and all sorts of drinks with it. And I loved the flavor growing up. Even still to this day, I still have not had a fresh jamun.
One day.
Yeah, one day.
One day that will be the moment. But of course, with many of these products, you can go to Patel
Yes.
Brothers, your local South Asian grocery store, or even H Mart, and find many of these products in the freezer, right? And,
yeah,
and they're there and they're great, and that's part of baking with this in mind.
Yeah, I would say but I am all for using frozen berries and fruits in desserts because they're packed at like their peak ripeness and usually peak season. So they're extra delicious in my opinion.
Yeah, of course. And like you're going to be baking anyway,
Yeah.
so that you don't need to have the whole fruit there in its full, fresh form. So Faluda, and I was in India and I got to try some, and you make a really strong statement, which I agree with. Why is Faluda the queen of fancy dessert drinks?
I mean, if you've seen a Faluda, like it's got so many components to it, and it's just so pretty to look. Like you look at it and you sit there looking at it like, oh, what is everything? You have vermicelli, you have ice cream, you have milk, you have, pink hues of rose going through it. And then you have sometimes you have strawberries in it. I've seen them with strawberries. Mine has strawberries, but there's just a visual feast. There's so many, kind of like halo halo or any one of the kind of cold Asian desserts. It's all about layers of texture. And it's so pretty in pink. It's such a gorgeous color. Like, it just makes you happy. People get excited when people see Faluda. They're like, oh, yes, I need to have it.
It is gorgeous dessert, and I got to go to a place called the Parsi Dairy Bar in Mumbai, and I had Faluda and I had a lassi with buffalo milk, and
oh my god,
it really opened up this realm of Indian desserts to me, and I have to just plug that place. It's amazing.
Oh my god, yeah, buffalo milk makes everything better. It's so naturally sweet. It's
such a good call. Yes,
like when we were in India, my mom would constantly ask for like, oh, make sure you don't put sugar in your chai. Because when you go to people's houses, they make chai for you. And each time my mom's like, oh, did you put sugar in this? And they're like, no, this is just how sweet buffalo milk is.
So let's talk about chai a bit, because I think it's definitely an entry point for many of our listeners, and really I'd love to get your take. There's many different types of chais, chai masala, there's Irani style
Mhm.
chai, and really, do you have a favorite chai or a way that you make chai?
Yes, I learned from my maternal grandmother how to make chai, and it's a very specific way of making it. Um, I have the recipe in my first cookbook, and then I shared a chai masala recipe in this cookbook. But one of the main keys for us is less water, more milk. Um,
Yep.
Depending on like where in India you're from, a lot of people either do equal parts water and milk, or it's just a splash of milk. Um, but for us, it was always way more milk. It's like 75 to 80% milk, and the rest is water. You just have enough water to cover the tea. And you're using CTC tea. So
Of course.
you're not trying to,
explain what that is.
yeah, it's called CTC is crushed hair curl. It's a byproduct of um a it's a process that's done with basically the crappy parts of black tea.
Yeah.
It was something that the British created so that they could sell the little twigs and bits left over after processing the leaves back to the Indian populace, because it was just a new market for them. Um, it's a bit more tannic than the leaves, and it can be depending on where you get it from, it can also be a little bit more bitter. But you need to have that tannic kind of drying effect. Um, that's what makes chai chai, in my opinion. And you don't want to use the good expensive stuff. This is where you get the cheap, Wagh Bakri or Lipton. um, or you can get a nice blend from One Stripe Chai or Kula Goodies or the Chai Box, which are amazing small chai makers across the US. And you boil it in just enough water to cover the tea. You add your chai masala to it. Um, and then once it starts simmering really hard, you add your milk and you let that simmer up the sides 3 times. Why 3? Because that's what my grandma did. Everyone does it differently. And it just makes it like a little bit more foamy and rich. And then you strain that into your cup. And then my grandma would pour a little extra milk on top to one, cool it down, but also add more milk to it and dilute the caffeine in it for me as a kid.
Yeah. Little ones maybe don't need all that caffeine. And couple follow-up questions. So when you talk about the 3 rises, are you basically just like doing a hard boil and then
Yep.
you're dropping heat and you're doing it 3 times?
Yep. We would let it, hard boil till it comes up the sides. And either we drop heat or take the pan right off the stove until it simmers
Yeah.
down and then put it back on.
Yeah.
And God forbid you let it simmer over the pot. I mean, my mom was like,
yeah.
ready, at the ready.
Yeah, you got to be mindful. And then the other question is, when you're talking about the milk, which 70% of chai, 75%. Now, are we talking about full, like whole milk? Are we talking about like how do you think about the milk you choose for your chai?
I like using whole milk, because I want that kind of like viscosity, that thickness to it. Also, you have more fat in it, and fat carries flavor. And spices have both water soluble and fat soluble compounds that make the chai taste so much better. Which is why you add the spices to the water first, so the water soluble, compounds, flavor compounds dilute out, or not dilute out, but disperse. And then when you add the milk, you have the fat that also carries a lot of it.
So Hetal, I got to ask you. You've got 2 cookbooks. You've got a great online community. You're doing content all the time. Is there a future in doing a brick and mortar and actually selling some of your baking to the population? Or am I just talking crazy?
I would love to, honestly. Rent is too high here.
Yeah.
I looked at places and they're like, oh, yeah, it's $11,000 a month, $25,000 a month, $22,000 a month. And I'm like, that's a lot of chai and cake. I always wanted to open up like a chai cafe with my baked goods and then also sell Gujarati snacks. Um,
Yeah.
but I don't know if it's in the cards here in the Bay. It is just too expensive, and I really don't want an investor because I've seen how bad it can be when you have investors and things go awry and like just awful. Um, and people get burned pretty bad. So I'd love to be able to bootstrap it, but I don't know if it'll happen in the Bay.
Yeah, maybe it's in different cities.
Yeah.
Maybe, but yeah, I hear you. It's the highest rents in the country that you're dealing with. But so what's the next year like for you once the book's out? Do you have plans for more television? What's going on?
Book tour. So I'll be on tour in all throughout basically October till March. So if you want to come say hi, I would love to see you. um, and then I am working on book 3. Um,
Amazing.
so I'm working on a proposal right now. Hopefully I get it shopped and a publisher by the end of the year. And this time I want to enter, I want to enter a savory world and showcase um, the kind of dishes I grew up with that I had on a regular basis with my parents.
I mean, Hetal, like a Gujarati book from you, like that goes to the savory side.
Yeah.
I welcome that. I think that would be so cool to see.
Yeah, I really want to like highlight the produce, especially now in this globalized world. Like when I was growing up, finding Gujarati produce, things like bottle gourd or okra or Chinese long beans, um, or bitter melon. It was not easy. We'd have to drive an hour to Jackson Heights or an hour to Edison to get it at the Indian store. And nowadays, you start seeing these type of produce. I mean, I went to Safeway recently, and they had bottle gourd, and I was like, "What?" um, or even having access to the peppers. Now that there's a little bit more access to the produce that I grew up with, I think it's like the perfect time to drop a super duper Gujarati cookbook.
So cool. I can't wait to have you back to talk about that. It'll be exciting. On This Is Taste, we have guests about the discerning taste. So to close this interview, here's a little rapid fire, fast and furious taste check. Are you ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
The best fruit.
Mangoes.
Okay, so follow question. How do you shop for a mango?
Well, one is I like give them a little squeeze, kind of like you do with an avocado. And then smell. If they don't smell, if I can't smell the mango at all, it's not going to be good.
The worst vegetable.
Oh, bitter gourd.
So you mention it as like something you want to seek out, but you're calling it the
Oh,
worst. I love this. Can't.
This is one of those things where I will continue eating it in the hopes that one day I might be like, yeah, that's not bad.
Yeah. Just describe the flavor profile for those who haven't had it. I've had it, and I gotta say, mixed review for me.
It's extremely bitter. They are like the way my mom cooks it. She cooks very healthy, so she'll like steam it and then like cook it up with some spices or stuff it with a bunch of spices. But the bitterness, I just can't do it. I can't do it. It's not for me. But I have, friends that it's like a deep, earthy bitterness that like sticks to your taste buds. It's not just a moment of bitterness. It's like it stays with you. It tastes.
It's like asafoetida,
Yeah.
a little bit like hing asafoetida in that realm.
Yeah. It just stays with you, and then like there's nothing you can do about it once it's there.
Yeah. Loaded question here. The best dessert.
Ooh. Oh, Golfi. I love a good Golfi.
Explain that one.
So Golfi, it's not, I guess it's not really technically, I would say, an ice cream, but Golfi, when it's traditionally made, is you take whole fat milk and, full fat milk or whole milk, and you cook it down until most of the water has evaporated off and it's mostly fatty. Then you add sugar to it and your flavoring compounds, like some people add pistachio or saffron or cardamom. And then you freeze it. And it's got this like, it's harder than an ice cream and harder than a semi-frodo. But it's got this like melty, rich, creamy texture to it. Because the water's evaporated off and it's mostly just fat and sugar. It's just extra delicious.
Do you spin it at all? Is there any
No.
motion, or you just like freeze it in a bowl?
Yeah, you freeze it like in either a mold, like popsicle molds. Typically, they're like long metal popsicle molds with like a stick in it. But yeah, you just freeze it in a popsicle mold, and that's that.
Sounds amazing. And you have a recipe in your new book?
I have a couple recipes, but they're more traditional style ice cream. In my first cookbook, I have a very traditional kulfi recipe for it's a Mexican hot chocolate kulfi. And it has that long process of cooking the milk down until it's at the right place.
Your favorite American fast food chain?
Oh, Taco Bell.
Oh, stop. Let's go. What's your order? Such a good call. It's mine too.
Mexican pizza with sub the beef with beans. And then the other is I love doing a crunch wrap, and then I'll add the red sauce that's in a Mexican pizza in there. It's just so good. I think one, because you could literally turn anything into a vegetarian dish because you just sub the meat with beans. And I don't know which Indian person figured it out and like spread the word, but that is the most vegetarian friendly fast food chain there is. And it's got a cult following. Like we would go to, Diwali celebration, then, post parties at the Taco Bell parking lot.
I love that memory. That's so great. I know Kush Prashad was on the show and also expressed a deep love of Taco Bell.
Yes.
So good. Your favorite cookbook of all time?
Okay. It depends on the seasons. Currently, I have my one steadfast, and this may seem weird, but it's called the Settlement Cookbook. It is a very old cookbook, and it has very old recipes in it, but they work. It's consistent. The cookbook, I think, was first written, I want to say, in the 1800s, the late 1800s.
Yeah.
And the recipes are not too particularly like defined. Like it'd be like, oh, bake it in a moderate oven.
Yeah. It gives you a little bit of a puzzle.
Yeah. But the recipes and the ratios from that cookbook, they just work every single time, and they're just so good.
I love that you mentioned it. We wrote a feature on the Settlement Cookbook. I'm going to say 2018, and I'll link to it in the show notes. It is absolutely a classic American cookbook, and I'm so happy that you have actually cooked from it and have this story. It's really cool.
Yeah, and it has like such traditional, especially a lot of German and Dutch recipes, and I think it's like really interesting to see like, oh, that's how it's traditionally made, and like then seeing what it's become now, like the kuchen and strudel and stuff. It's just interesting to see.
Your favorite city outside America to visit for food?
Toronto.
Do tell. It's a great city.
Every place I went to eat in Toronto was phenomenal. High end, hole in the walls, just amazing. I had, Trinidadian doubles, absolutely amazing. Indian food there, amazing. Vegetarian and vegan restaurants, Planta Queen, so good. Thai food at Pai, insane. Like everything I ate there was phenomenally delicious.
You heard that, book that Air Canada flight, get to Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of, I feel like, underrated cities.
Oh, 100%.
A lot of Americans don't go. Yeah.
Yeah. I would go back just for the food, like multiple times.
Couple more. A cuisine you would like to learn more about?
Ooh, I would say like Nigerian cuisine. And I guess overall, even just African cuisine. I know there's been a lot of movement between, India and Africa, and a lot of trade, a lot of immigration and things like that. But there aren't that many, other than Ethiopian food, I don't know that much about other African cuisines. And I'd love to be, I'm so curious. I want to know what the texture of fufu is. I want to try nugusi. I want to know ugali is. And like, I'm intrigued because I've never had it. And I want to just learn more about it.
Last one, your favorite sandwich.
Okay. In Philly, there is a deli. It was right next to the pizza place I worked at called Koch's Deli. And they have a sandwich called the cheese sandwich. Because again, being vegetarian, typically it's the only option is the cheese sandwich. But this cheese sandwich has a good 2 inches of cheese in it. Like, it's like basically they replace the cold cuts with cheese. And it's just insanely good.
I mean, the East Coast knows how to go hard with the cheese.
Yeah.
I love like a 2-inch cheese sandwich. I think by the inch, the more inches, the better.
Yeah.
I love that thought.
It's so good. And then they have like, you got to get oil and vinegar, salt, pepper, oregano with the shredded lettuce. And then it's got to be a sesame seeded hoagie roll.
Oh, yeah. Completely agree. Condiments?
Yeah. Mayo, and really that's it. I don't do mustard, and it's got to just be mayo. And I just want to taste the cheese.
We are on the same wavelength for sandwiches. I love mayo only, maybe a little salt and pepper. Into so that. Good. Hetal Vasavada, thank you so much for joining This Is Taste.
Thank you so much for having me.
This Is Taste is hosted by Matt Rodbard and me, Eliza Abarbanel. The show is produced by Shalia Harris and Pat Stango and edited by Clayton Gumbert. Theme music by Steve Rydell. Visit Taste online at tastecooking.com and make sure to subscribe to our newsletter for updates on all cool things happening.